In the United States, the racial wealth gap, looking at the median, half above, half below, median family financial wealth of white and first African American and then Latino households, a couple of baseline pieces of information. I like to go to the percentages. You can look at the numbers, if you will. Essentially, the median or typical African American household has 6 cents in wealth for every dollar of wealth that the typical white household has. Now, I probably should have started reminded us what the income disparity is. The typical median African American family has about 54 to 60 cents, it depends on the year, of income, of earned income, for every dollar of earned income that the white family has. And that is the standard that we typically have taken as what's the project around economic inequality in the United States? It's to close that gap. But think about how the paradigm changes if our project is getting from somewhere from 60 cents on a dollar to something we might define as parity, 95, 96, 97, dare we say 100. And think about how the project changes if now we have to think about how do you get from 6 cents on a dollar to something we can define as parity.
Hello guys, welcome back to the channel. This is Eugene Doki Stories. So the wealth gap between black people and white people keeps on increasing over time. Even if we people have come up with ways of trying to cap the differences between the wealth gap between black people and white people. Remember, according to the year 2021, the reserve government, the finance reserve, stated that there is an increased rate between the inequalities when it comes to wealth between the black people and white people. And why is this increasing? Since we know slavery happened a long time ago, and that's when there was so much big, as the history records, that's when there was a big margin when it comes to wealth gap between black people and white people. And now, why is this gap still increasing until today? Another question that I would like to ask and I would like to know, is it that hard work itself is not enough for the black people? Because according to what this professor is going to say in regards to black wealth and white wealth, the disparities between the two groups, we are going to look how it's really so hard for a black person, to catch up with this, because there are some systems which still exhibit these margins that we are seeing. Remember things like riddling. We have things like discriminatory lending practices, like giving, lending a given group and making it so hard for some groups to also get the opportunity of getting resources through credits. So amongst other factors today, which we are going to see, or which the professor is going to say, because according to the stats which was taken the year 2021 regarding the inequalities when it comes to wealth between black people and white people, we are seeing that there is an increasing gap. The gap keeps on increasing, and it's increasing exponentially. And now we're wondering, is it that the statutory measures that are being put to cap this difference, is it not enough? And if this is happening, where are the potholes? Where is this really? Why is this still really happening until today? Because we know slavery and slave trade and working for free ended a long time ago. And I know we have people like activists who have come out, things like the Black Lives Matter. We have activists, we have black writers, we have the government itself have tried to look into this. But why are we still having, why are we still having this happen until today? So I want to welcome you to this presentation, and I hope that we get to learn through this presentation from this professor, because I believe that this discussion is important, and I'm going to be back and I'm going to be telling you why, for majority of black people, why hard work itself, it's not going to be enough to curb these differences, because the differences, even until today, 2024, the differences are still increasing tremendously. the margin between the black people in wealth accumulation. And I think these are what we're going to talk about, what is called the structural racism. How are the systems treating people when it comes to things dealing with development of the black community? How are they perpetuating this? And how is the system failing black people? That's talking about the structural racism, which is happening especially in financial sectors of the black community. So I'm going to be back with my critical analysis on this video and I hope that you get to learn through this video. If you're interested in the full videos, I'm going to place the link down so that you can go watch the full video and let's come have a discussion about it. Until then, this is your presenter using Doc Stories. Let's meet at the end as I'll be giving you my commentary on the same. Let's dive into it.
All right. So when we think about economic equity and inequality in the United States, income is critically important, but we have to bring into that picture family wealth. For Latino households, it's 7 cents on the dollar. It's very close. It's very close. All right. Now, that data is from nationally representative samples. All right. So I have a lot of confidence in it. Different samples give us slightly different numbers, but the ratios, the 6 and 7 cents on the dollar, are pretty constant. As a sociologist, we call that a pattern, something that repeats itself over and over, and you see the same data no matter almost what database one uses. All right. So we can look at that. As one of our projects at an institute that I'm very involved in, in working with community-based organizations, we shifted the question a little bit. And the question started to become not what is the racial wealth gap in the United States, but over a period of time, is it increasing, narrowing, or staying the same? And this, I think, is a great puzzle in thinking for people who like to think about what is the impact of the past on the present. There's a line of thought that I think goes like this. Whatever happened in the past was horrible, and it provides us with different starting points, especially in terms of family wealth. But whatever that starting point we got should be about the same. The level shouldn't differ. The lines or the slope shouldn't differ. And what I'm going to suggest is if that line for white families goes up and it doesn't for African American families to the same degree, then what's getting worse. If those lines start to converge at some point, it's getting better. And we can think about why that might be the case. So what we did was to follow the same set of families in a data set that allowed us to first look at them from 1984 to 2009 and then 2011, so a period of 25, 27 years, and to ask the question, what happened to the racial wealth gap among that same set of families experiencing similar public school systems, similar enough American social and public policy, the American political environment, American workplace and recessions and boom periods. And how did all that work itself out in terms of black wealth, white wealth? Well, the first data point you see on the far left, and the dollars are calibrated to 2009 dollars, parenthetically here. Median wealth, white families, is the blue line. And it has a great trajectory. Except for a blip, the Great Recession, has a great trajectory. It increases in a very robust manner. The dollars are adjusted for inflation. That's real growth. The African American line here is the red or magenta-ish line closer to the bottom. And there are two things that need to be pointed out. One, very importantly, there is some very good growth. But at the same time, look at the space in the middle. The distance between the lines keeps growing, such that the racial wealth gap following the same set of families as they go through the life course in all those institutions we talked about almost triples. Right. Palpably, objectively, the racial wealth gap as I think, a good metric of economic racial inequality in the United States gets worse, and significantly worse. I've been doing this work for a long time, and it's, I like to say, one of the amazing factoids, if you will, is that when I talk, nobody has ever challenged the data. No one's come out and said, oh, Shapiro, you're full of it. Social sciences doesn't know what they're doing. What's the error margins? I've got another, I've got two neighbors, one black and one white, and they do this and they do that. The data points are never really challenged at all. What is challenged vehemently is the narrative. What's the explanation? Why is the racial wealth gap growing in the United States? So to try and get at, in a more scientific way, some answers to those questions, we looked at this chart that is a product of some of our research, and did some relatively deep analysis that tried with regressions and other techniques that asked the question, what accounts for the largest areas of growth in the racial wealth gap in the United States? And just quickly, because I'm going to go into it in a bit more detail momentarily, just quickly, by far the largest area is home ownership and property ownership. It accounts for something like 28% of the difference in the growth between white and black wealth. Second area includes income, and it is not family income, it is the increase in income between 1984 and 2009. That is, what's the wealth action, if you will, on every dollar of increased income? Does it look similar for whites as it does for African Americans? And that turned out to be also a very large driver of the increasing racial wealth gap. Education, and here, again, we were not looking, if you will, simply at educational or achievement gaps. We were looking at college-educated black and white families and controlling for that and asking, is the return on wealth from that same, at least degree, what does that look like in terms of how it translates or converts to wealth for white and black families? That also is a large producer of both wealth and an increase in the racial wealth gap. So I want to be clear, education is important, especially higher education, and the jobs, the income, and the wealth that flow from that are far greater than a high school education. At the same time, there are dynamics within that process and how those educational achievements are rewarded that continues to drive the racial wealth gap in the United States. All right, so let me get to what I really want to get to. I want to look at three of the areas of largest drivers. I want to start with education. I'm going to go to work and income, and I want to end with home ownership because it's the deepest and it's the most complicated one to think about and to talk about. So eliminating disparities in college education and the return on a college degree in the work we've done has a modest direct impact on the racial wealth gap. Now let me explain what I mean by that first and how we got to that, and then I'll show a few numbers to indicate it. We have produced, quick advertisement here, we've produced a tool that we call the racial wealth audit. And it is a technique, a set of techniques really, that allows us to look at knowing what the racial wealth gap is, and having modeled through what are the predictors of black wealth, what are the predictors of white wealth, what are the predictors of Latino wealth. If you change those predictors, how much more or less wealth one gets. So that allows us to look at a policy or a policy proposal or an institutional change and ask the question, if whites and blacks and Latinos had the same college degrees, what would the action be on closing the racial wealth gap? All right. So now here I want to start posing it's not really a dichotomy, let's call it a spectrum, because I'm not sure it's a binary at all here, because I want to talk about how it intersects. That's talking about rates. That's talking about access. That's talking, if you will, paradigmatically of liberals and many of my friends in the progressive movement, right? Where we focus on access to college and college completion. Very important. I am not diminishing that by any means whatsoever. All right. But that's what I call the access and the opportunity. As an other part of that, we don't ask the question, and this is what I am going to try to ask and answer a bit and confuse me and everybody else. The question we want to ask is, for that college completion, are there structures that actually produced different wealth for whites and blacks? And produces it in a way that there is more wealth, that it actually increases or decreases the racial wealth gap. All right, so quick pieces of data here. I indicated there would be modest action. If policy, or anything else, successfully eliminated racial disparities in college graduation rates, black wealth would grow per every family, if you will, about $1,300. The gap, racial wealth gap between whites and blacks, would shrink by about 1%. Right. The $1,300 gain is very important. I want to keep emphasizing that. But I also want to suggest, if we're looking at that glass about how to get parity and the projects that are needed and the structural changes that are needed to move us in that direction, simply removing barriers to college graduation rates doesn't have a whole lot of action at that level. Latinos, the action is a little greater. It reduces the racial wealth gap by about 3%. Right. There's more action. If we hypothetically say, let me tell you how we do this quickly. For the wealth that a white family returns or converts for a college degree, if we take that and give it hypothetically in a model to African American or Latino families, then you've equalized the return. You've said that the return from a college degree is roughly the same for whites, African Americans, and Latinos. If this were done, black wealth would grow by $10,000, Latino growth by about $5,800. The racial wealth gap between whites and African Americans shrinks or narrows by 10%. 1% reduction on equalizing rates of college completion, 10% action on the return to wealth. For Latinos, it's 6%. All right, so now hopefully you've got the logic I'm trying to work through here. Work and income. I want to remind people here, as well as myself, that when we're talking about income in this particular model and project, we're talking about income gains. Not income per se, but over a period of time. What's the action on making income equal on the first part, and then on the second part, equalizing the wealth return from every additional dollar of income gains? So on the opportunity, black income, black wealth grows very robustly. It's something we'd love to, quote, give to everybody. $11,000. To Latinos, $8,700. That closes the black-white gap by 11%. It closes the racial wealth gap with Latino and white households by 9%. All right. Some nice action. Look what happens when we flip that question and ask not just about the rates, but the return to wealth, the conversion to wealth. And the economists in the audience are going to slam me. I'm sure some people will have fun with that later by using the return to wealth phrase. The nexus, if you will. Black wealth would grow $44,000. Latino wealth would grow 51,000. Not simply, by getting our hands on the structures that convert gains in income to wealth accumulation for families of color, the racial wealth gap would shrink by 43% and 50% respectively. All right, now I want to come back to this because we definitely want to talk about the structures involved. The third area, home ownership. The home ownership gap is about 23–24% between whites and African Americans in terms of rate of home ownership. It closed a little bit towards the end of the 1990s and closed a little bit again around just before the housing and foreclosure crash around 2006 or so. Looking at the opportunity question, eliminating disparities in home ownership rates, that is making the black and white home ownership rate and Latino home ownership rate would substantially reduce the racial wealth gap. And here's what some of the data looks like. Look at the wealth that it adds. But just to simplify here, the racial wealth gap, the white-black racial wealth gap would shrink 31%. The Latino-white racial wealth gap would shrink 28%. Right. If home ownership rates were simply equal, and here I really get, if you will, to my, my subtitle, The Continuity of Deep Structures. Residential segregation, I think, is without a doubt one, if not the most significantly deep structure in the United States that orders social relations to a degree that most people have no idea about, from schools to public safety to networks to property values to home equity to what your home is worth to Ferguson. If returns on home ownership, that is, if residential segregation either didn't exist or didn't have the same ramifications of owning a home in a relatively homogeneous white neighborhood, returns a lot more wealth about what that home is valued than if that were exact same home were in a diverse community, and a lot more if that home were in a community of color. Even if you control for the number of blades of grass and the year the home was built. As real estate realtors like to say, location, location, location. The deconstruct of location, location, location is demographics, demographics, demographics. Who's the community? What's the demographic composition of that community? All right. If those structures somehow we got a hold of, and there were a lot more equity, the racial wealth gap would shrink about 16% for African Americans, and in a divergent way, which I've really yet to totally understand at all, would shrink the white Latino racial wealth gap by considerably more, 41%. All right, I've tried to put this together in a quick table to look at some of the differences. So starting with college, then work and income, especially gains in income over a long period of time, and home ownership. The access and opportunity closure of the racial wealth gap is 1%, just to reiterate quickly, 1% for African Americans, 3% for Latinos. And if we work on the wealth conversion, it's 10% and 6%. All right. Let me suggest one thing simply, and then go to what's going to make our heads explode a little bit, I hope. It does me, at least. Sort of. Looking at opportunity and access is not enough. All right. That gets us a long way. And that struggle and that battle has not been won. And we need to keep working on it. But we also have to understand that it's partway. And I would suggest the harder, longer-term work needs to be done on understanding what those structures are, reforming them in a non-reformist way that brings them to light, that has a tangle of public policy that helps to make those structures a lot more equitable. I think in most of the instances, this data indicates that working on the structure is at least as important, if not more so, than working on the opportunity. All right. Now, I don't want us to think of that as a dichotomy at all. And I think if we go back and look at the structures around home ownership, we will understand how deep those structures are and how much we need to lift up. So, the simple statement is I think it's probably impossible to equalize rates of home ownership without getting to the structures. That is, they intersect I think at a very deep level here. I want to go back to residential segregation, which varies according to region, according to metropolitan area, but in many areas of the country, especially the Northeast and the Midwest, there's not been a whole lot of positive movement. Some of the more quickly or rapidly growing cities, especially those in the Southwest and the West, residential segregation, we do see some improvements. I want to go back and start with the simple fact that the same home, why is it that the same home is worth and increases in value more in a relatively homogeneous white community than it does in a diverse community or a community of color? Right. I think part of the equation has to do with attitudes and psychology. Part of it has to do with public policy, and a large part of it has to do with custom. I like to use the metaphor. It's not really a metaphor at all. It's an illustration out of our context that I think makes this realer. I had the great opportunity of spending half a year in South Africa in 2011 trying to understand how a different society deals with issues about race and wealth, the challenges of implementing constitutional and legal mandates around those very significant issues there, and political parties that are trying to do it. And in South Africa, people may know there is something called townships. And the unlikely or naive visitor that drives through Johannesburg or Cape Town, even more vividly so, and notices large swaths of areas that seriously has the infrastructure, the physical beauty, could look like any upper middle-class American suburb. And yes, is largely white, especially in Cape Town. And then drive not very far, turn a few corners, and be a mile or so away, and you see townships, you see shacks, you see infrastructures where water, where electricity is problematic. And you as the bystander, as the person who's driving by, you wonder how life is maintained and constructed in those kinds of communities. And the naive viewer, as I think many Americans maybe want to do in our society, often ask the question, why do they choose to live there? The choice in South Africa happened because of a bulldozer, where diverse communities literally were bulldozed because they were diverse communities, and populations parceled out, and those townships were created as a part of public policy. That's what Kailicha and the townships in Cape Town are about. That's what many of the townships around Johannesburg are about. Right. They're created out of historical moments. They're created out of public policy to make very robust points that those regimes thought were necessary. Now, not quite at the same force of a bulldozer and the army literally that enforces it, but communities in the United States, because of property laws, because of redlining, because of banking discrimination, because of insurance discrimination, because of real estate discrimination. We have a long history of people being constructed and parceled out into different communities. And today, no matter what we think of that particular history, the consequences and the impact and the legacy lives with us. It lives with us not simply in all the social relations and the community amenities and the opportunities and the challenges that those communities present, but for my little story here around family wealth, there's a very large implication that tells us that a home that is owned in a diverse, much less a community of color, is not going to increase in value, that is, create as much wealth as it does if it were located in a relatively homogeneous white community, especially if that community is on the upper end of the income scale. I think we kind of know that story a bit, but part of the story that we don't know nearly as well are the ways in which federal and local public policy reinforces that and even provides incentives. And I don't want to go through the whole history, if you will, around how highways were developed, around redlining by the Federal Housing Authority. I think there's some great books and articles that tell that history fairly well. But I want to jump up to the moment that we have at hand today. We have something that I call the wealth budget of the federal government. And the wealth budget of the federal government is a series of very robust incentives in the tax code that reward people for behaving in certain ways. The largest incentive for individual wealth accumulation in the United States is the home mortgage interest deduction. Does anybody know offhand, Professor Quiz here, does anybody know offhand what the Department of Housing and Urban Development's annual budget is for public housing? Can we take a guess? It's about $35 billion. It's about $35 billion. Right. If one were to ask, what's the housing policy of the United States government, most people would say, well, it's Section 8, it's subsidized housing, it's public housing, it's projects, it's that kind of stuff that we define as welfare in one way or another. But budgets tell us something very different. If we look not just at the ideological construction of what the housing policy is of the United States, but actually look at resources, annually we invest as a public investment of the American society about $200 billion a year in the home mortgage interest deduction. Essentially, taxes that those of us that are homeowners, and if we still have mortgages, don't have to pay. A public investment for what was deemed to be, and actually could make it's a good case, was a public good when the incentive was first introduced. But implemented in a way that it was wholly discriminatory, and that those levels of discrimination have continued to spiral out of control. 200 billion versus 35 billion. So we look at that over a 5-year period, a 6-year period. The Urban Institute released a study last summer that looked at some of the provisions of the wealth budget of the United States government over a 6-year period. They did it last year, this year, and then they took it out another 4 years. And among other things, what that study showed is that when we think of it in the long term, what is being invested to reinforce contemporary discrimination in housing markets, probably the firmest pillar of that structure is the home mortgage interest deduction. And there are a lot of other pillars around it. It's a structure of many pillars, I want to suggest. Over a 6-year period, the public, we as the public invests about $1.2 trillion in that public investment. Now that is not chump change. It's way too many zeros for me to comprehend. But let me suggest that, and there is a movement building around this, so I'm not just totally talking out of my top of the head here. Think about, are there ways to reform that, to reconstruct that, to take that pot and say, I don't want to lose that 1.2 trillion. I want to go after what was the original public good of housing and community development, and we know how to invest that and implement it in a much more efficient way economically, and we know how to do it in a way that is much more equitable. $1.2 trillion. It's a large budget currently used in a very regressive, racially regressive, and economically regressive fashion, and can be turned around. There are a lot of proposals. We know how to do it. I want to suggest it's obviously, not obviously, at the end of the day, it is a question of political will. It's a question of social movements. It's a question of feet and movement on the ground that creates the resources that really makes those kinds of non-reform reforms, those kinds of deep structural reforms that allow us to break some of the continuity of some of those deep structures. All right. That's just one area in the housing. Later, at different points in time, I'd be happy to talk about the structures involved with work and increased income, and the sort of the occupational segregation that still exists, the access to, or lack of access or differential access to benefits. And what does that mean? That means retirement savings. That means health and dental. That means paid sick leave. That means maternity leave. The kinds of things that saves money for some families and produces wealth for some families in a highly discriminatory way, at least in the way it works out. Right? And that's why partially, I think largely, the return from increased income, the returns to wealth, look so different for whites, African Americans, and Latinos. All right. I do want to try and leave some time here, so let me just try and wrap it up very quickly and suggest that I really want us to think about and try to be a little provocative about breaking that liberal, semi-progressive paradigm up and allowing us to create the space where we need to move beyond opportunity and access, knowing that fight is not won fully, but that's not where we need to stop, and our thinking needs to keep pushing us forward. So I'd like to say thank you very much, especially to all of the people, the leaders and the workers that helped to bring us all here together today. And I always end slides like this and presentations like this by reminding some people, all of us, that there's some great jobs at the Institute I direct, and if this is the kind of passionate work for social justice that pays pretty well and good benefits, look at our website. We always have things up, and we have a very robust graduate program, PhD program, one of the first in the nation, built around the concentration of assets and inequalities. So thank you very much.
Welcome back to the channel. Here with me, this is Eugene Talk Stories, and as I promised you, I was to come with a presentation on regards to this, because the question is, why do you think just working at itself is not enough for the Black people? And it is time that we, as the Black community, we come together, we be smart in how we're dealing with these issues, because the structural racism itself It's not going to end unless we find ways of generally dealing with these issues and dealing with them in the best common way. And you ask yourself, why are we still having the big margin when it comes to wealth accumulation between the black people and white people? Welcome back. This is your presenter, Eugene Doc Stories, and I'm going to be telling you reasons as to why it keeps on increasing exponentially. Ironically, we expected that the wealth gap between black people and white people to reduce, but we are not seeing that happening. So when that's not happening, it means that there are some things that we can talk about, some things that we can do to make these happen. However, with me here, I'm here to present you why we are still facing these big margin between black people and white people when it comes to wealth accumulation. So the first one is discriminatory lending practices. Black Americans have higher mortgage interest rates and are more likely to be denied loans compared to white applicants with similar financial profiles. You get to understand what's really happening. So my understanding of this concept is that sometimes, whether you're black or a white person, maybe you have an idea. We are human beings, we have ideas, right? And you want to start a project, or you want to start to build something, or you want to build a business, or you want to start a company. So you go to the bank, and you tell them that, okay, I have this idea. These are the assets that I have. This is what I can do, and I need this kind of money. And now maybe you have a brilliant idea, something that can create wealth for the community, for the black community, or for the white community, or generally for the Americans. But you find that if you're a black person, if you're not a white person, so it's not easier for you to secure these loans. Because, so you see, if a black person has a project that could develop their economy, it's really hard for them to grow because you're not going to be given loans. Because trust me, at some point we need the loans. You have an idea, something that can change, something that can change the world, something that can make your community grow. But this is not going to happen because you're not going to be given this loan yet. This is going to be given to another person. So you understand why the wealth difference is still getting bigger and bigger with time. Because if all of us needs the loan, we have projects to develop, and I can't get the loan because I'm a black person, and yet the white person gets the loan. On top of that, you have the advantages of maybe owning some assets that your ancestors left you, and the black person didn't get that. And now when it comes to loan, you also acquire. Now you understand why there is this big margin when it comes to wealth accumulation and wealth creation between black people and white people. That's why hard work itself, it's not enough. You're asking yourself, what can you do in regards to this? Another thing, according to the year 2008 financial crisis, black homeowners were disappropriately targeted with subprime mortgages, leading to higher foreclosure rates in black communities. The second one, I'm going to talk about educational inequality. Yes, they say that education is power, right? And an empowered community is an educated community. Community which is educated, it's easier for them to acquire knowledge, use these resources, that's the mind that they have acquired through school, to build wealth, to build their community. So schools which are located mostly in the black community, they usually receive less fundings. And this is something which happens. I'm not just standing here telling you lies. This is the truth. So if they receive less fundings, it means that the resources that the schools have can't really sustain some number of school-going kids or school-going people. So it means that the development or the scale in which they might expound on how they can utilize the knowledge that students have to make them create wealth, it is also faced with a problem. You know, even the student loan debt that students have been given. For instance, college graduates tend to have higher student loan debt and face more difficulties in repayment as compared to the white community. So this shows you are a black person and you've learned through student loan, you applied for the loan and you got the loan, and now you gotta pay for it. You're working, the money that you're getting, some of it is going to the other group, is going to pay the loan debt. Whereas the white children who never faced the same problem, they didn't have to do that. And the money that they're getting, maybe just small amount of it, they use it to pay for the date. So this is something which really happens. And you get to understand where we lose our resources. I'm also going to talk about employment and discrimination as my third point. Study shows that the resumes with black sounding names receive fewer callbacks. Wages gaps persist, with black workers earning less than their white counterparts for the same roles. Really, this happens. You have worked so hard, applied for the loan, to go to school. Now it reaches a point where you need to secure a job. You are issuing your resume, you're not being called back. And studies have shown that black names that have sent their resumes have received the fewest callbacks, as compared to white people. So the structural racism itself, it's the one which is making this gap to still continue to be bigger. And as much as we are having black people who are working hard, black people who are creative, black people who are coming out to create the world for themselves, you realize that it's not easier for them for majority of people, it's not really easier to make it big. That's why I really, really salute black people who have made it big in the States, because I know the structural racism itself, it's something which is serious and it's something which really happens. I'm also going to talk about criminal justice system as also a point that helps keeps this gap or this margin to be bigger. Black Americans are disproportionately targeted and incarcerated, disrupting economic stability. Now, what's the backbone of any community? It is the youth, right? Where is the largest number of black youths going? In the jail, right? So this shows you that the community is left with the population which is less energetic, less active. When they are left with this, it means that the production system in this community is a bit slowed down as compared to the white community. So you get to see the differences of how these things happen. So when we have a lot of youths who are not building the economy, when the youths are not building the economy, it means that there is less human resource which are being put to create wealth for the black community, leaving maybe the older people who their manpower is a little bit lesser. So you realize that the wealth which is being created in the black community cannot be compared to the wealth which is created in the white community. I'm also going to talk about war on drugs and our criminal justice system. Policies from the 1980s and 1990s led to mass incarceration of black individuals for nonviolent drug offenses and other things which step on the black youth population. Yeah, the black youth population. As I said, the youth really matters in any economy. They have the power of controlling the manpower, the human resource, the young minds, the technocrats. So if we don't have them, we have them in jail. In the black community, who are going to produce these goods? Who are going to come up with these genius ideas if they're not these young people that people are looking up to? You might want to ask yourself that question, but it's something which you should be knowing by now, because if they're all in jail, that only leaves you with the fact that we don't have people to work to these places. So, generally, just tell me what you think about this video. I would really like to know your opinion in regards to this. And just know that every day, it's always a learning day. And I hope that you will always come back so that we get to learn together. As you know, this is your presenter, Eugene Doc Stories. And I hope you're doing fine wherever you are today. Until then, peace, love, and harmony. Salute.